Hello and welcome to Written Words. And today's video is one of our language focused videos. So we're going to zoom in on a particular aspect of language. Over the last couple of videos, we've been looking at the subject of essay writing and how to write a good essay. And another important aspect of an essay is the tone that you write it in and the level of language that you use. The level of language, the level of formality and the tone of language is technically known as register. We use it when we're speaking and when we're writing. It's about choosing the right level of language to suit the particular situation that you're in. And when we're speaking, we generally do it automatically. We tend not to think about the register we're using, but if you think back to conversations you've had, if you compare a conversation perhaps with somebody you don't know to a conversation with a close friend, you'll start to realise that the language that you use is slightly different depending on the situation. So when we're speaking, we tend to do that automatically. But when we're writing, it can be a little bit more difficult, as it often requires a certain amount of conscious thought. Just as situations vary on a scale from very informal to very formal, so does language. And it's important to choose the language that's at the same point in the scale as the situation that you're in. Unless, of course, you want to deliberately make the language sound out of place. If you want somebody to sound overly formal in an informal situation, or if you want somebody to sound very informal in a very formal situation so that they sound out of place. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's look at the word hello. Hello is a fairly neutral register. It's somewhere in the middle. It's neither formal nor informal. But if you were talking to a friend, you might say something like, hi. Or if you were talking to somebody you didn't know, perhaps you'd gone for a job interview, you might say good morning or good afternoon. The word yes, again, is fairly neutral in tone. But if you were talking to a friend, you might say yeah. Or in a formal situation, you might say that is correct. To eat is a fairly neutral word. But if you were chatting with your friends, you might suggest you grab a bite. Or in a particularly formal situation, somebody might use the term to dine. In general, writing is more formal than speech. When we're writing, we need to organise words into sentences and use correct grammatical structures to make it easier to understand. Whereas the spoken language benefits from other things that indicate meaning in addition to the words, such as your tone of voice, the volume you speak at, the pitch of your voice, and your body language, for example, also adds weight to the meaning of your words. But in writing, we don't have those kinds of things, so we need to make sure our language is clear. So in writing, a text to your best friend is probably going to be in an informal register, whereas a technical manual or a legal document will be in a formal register. And somewhere in the middle might be a short story, depending on the subject matter of the story, of course. Choosing the right register for your writing will make it feel natural, whereas if you use the wrong register for the situation, it will make your writing feel awkward and unnatural, and perhaps a little uncomfortable to read. So what's the difference in writing between informal and formal register? Of course, there is neutral writing, there is formal writing, and there is informal writing. So there are three main categories. But of course, they can be subdivided into an infinite number of categories. You can have something that's quite formal, very formal, or extremely formal. You can be quite informal, very informal, or extremely informal, depending on the situation. So in general, what does informal writing involve? Informal writing tends to be more chatty in style. It uses more slang, it uses more idioms. And if it's extremely informal, it might even use swearing. Although do bear in mind that swearing in writing often comes across as much stronger than swearing in spoken language. When you swear aloud, as soon as you finish speaking, it's gone. But when you write it, it's there forever. So it feels much stronger and much more permanent. So do bear that in mind if you're using swear words in writing. In informal writing also, grammatical rules can be relaxed to a certain extent, as long as the writing is still understandable. Formal writing, on the other hand, will follow grammar rules much more strictly, and spellings should be correct. You should avoid contractions like wasn't, I'm, it's, and so on, because they have a much more informal feel to them. And you should avoid slang and, of course, swearing. The only exception would be if you were quoting someone else's exact words. In formal writing, you should use correct terminology rather than colloquial terms for things. For example, a medical document will use the correct medical terminology rather than more colloquial words for parts of the body, illnesses, and so on. So, which registers are used in which kinds of writing? Let's take emails to start with. Emails tend to be less formal than the traditional written letter. But the language used in an email will vary depending on the type of email. If it's just a one-liner to a friend arranging to meet them, that could be quite informal. But if you're emailing someone to apply for a job, you will need to be fairly formal in that. Blogs tend to be quite informal in tone. They tend to be quite chatty, but there are situations when a blog might be formal depending on the nature of the posts that you're writing. Are you writing from a personal point of view, or are you writing on behalf of a company? And you have the company image to bear in mind. What is the nature of the topic? Is it something serious, or is it something light-hearted? And journalism is an interesting one as well. There are several levels of register you can find in journalistic writing. In my earlier video on newspaper writing, we compared different types of newspaper and the different tones used by the people writing the articles in there. And in books, a popular fiction novel, for example, will use a different register to an academic textbook. The academic textbook will be much more formal than the storytelling in a work of fiction. And then there is dialogue. If you're writing a work of fiction that includes dialogue, the dialogue may well be more informal in tone than the narrative, the rest of the writing, because the dialogue reflects the way people speak. So let's look now at a couple of examples. I am currently in the process of reading Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I'm reading it with an online group and discussing it chapter by chapter, which is very interesting. One of the things that Dickens does excellently is the way he portrays characters. His characters are very colourful and very different, and there are many ways that he does that, but one of the ways is the use of register. And in this particular passage that I've chosen from near the beginning of the novel, there are two characters speaking, and they are speaking in very different registers. One of the characters is Mrs. Pardiggle. Mrs. Pardiggle is a rather larger-than-life figure. She is a very self-important character and has tasked herself with improving the poorer classes. And she goes to visit a family and has a brief conversation with the father of the family in this poor household. "Well, my friends," said Mrs. Pardiggle, but her voice had not a friendly sound, I thought. It was much too businesslike and systematic. "How do you do, all of you? I am here again. I told you you couldn't tire me, you know. I am fond of hard work, and am true to my word." "There aren't," growled the man on the floor, whose head rested on his hand as he stared at us, "any more on you to come in, is there?" "No, my friend," said Mrs. Pardiggle, seating herself on one stool and knocking down another. "We are all here." "Because I thought there weren't enough for you, perhaps," said the man with his pipe between his lips, as he looked round upon us. So here you have Mrs. Pardiggle using a very formal tone, which the narrator Esther calls businesslike. And then there is the man in the house who uses a much more informal tone. He uses idioms, contractions, and incorrect grammar. And the contrast between the two characters is particularly striking as you read that episode. For my other example, I'm going to go back to the essay that we discussed in my previous video. I'm going to look at the first paragraph of the essay. Depending on the purpose of the essay that you're writing, it probably should be quite formal in tone. If you're submitting your essay for some kind of course, whether that's at school or at university, and it's going to be marked by an examiner on its academic merit, then you should probably use a more formal tone. However, if you've written it for general interest, perhaps to go on a blog or social media somewhere, then you might prefer a more chatty tone. So let's compare my first paragraph, which was quite formal in style, with a rather less formal version. The original paragraph went like this. The question of whether poems should rhyme is a complex and potentially emotive one. In this essay, I will visit both sides of the debate and attempt to determine which argument is the strongest. In order to do this, I will examine 4 poems, 2 of them rhyming and 2 non-rhyming, from different eras, and identify some of the advantages and disadvantages of these 2 different approaches. And now a more informal, chatty version that says basically the same thing but in a very different tone. Should poems rhyme? Well, that's a question and a half. And you're guaranteed to get plenty of folks hot under the collar if you open up a can of worms like that in a room full of poetry lovers. I reckon having a look at 4 poems might be as good a way as any to figure out the answer. 2 that rhyme and 2 that don't, maybe. Let's see what works and what doesn't, shall we? Okay, here goes. So let's compare the 2. The second one sounds like it's maybe part of a conversation. It asks questions. Should poems rhyme? Let's see what works and what doesn't, shall we? It also includes a lot of contractions. We've got that's, your, don't, let's, doesn't, and so on. And it uses idioms. That's a question and a half. Hot under the collar, opening up a can of worms, and so on. And it has some incomplete sentences. 2 that rhyme and 2 that don't. There's something missing there. It's not quite a full sentence. But you get the meaning. If this was a conversation, you'd understand what the person was talking about. But it's not quite complete enough to have a formal tone. And words like okay. Okay is pretty mild slang, but it's still slang. It's not something you ought to use in a formal situation. In the formal version, we have words like examine, whereas in the second one, we say have a look at. And in the first version, the question is referred to as potentially emotive, whereas in the second version, I've said it's going to get people hot under the collar. So a much more informal way of saying the same thing. And in the first version, I've said I'm going to identify some of the advantages and disadvantages of the 2 different approaches. Very formal way of saying, let's see what works and what doesn't, shall we? Which is what I've said in the second version. The 2 paragraphs essentially say the same thing, but in very different ways and would be used for very different purposes, for very different situations. One of the things I found very interesting when I was writing the essay was choosing the correct register, because I'd originally talked about the same topic in a video. The video was in a spoken format. It was a much more chatty style. It was a very different tone. And so saying the same thing in a more formal tone in an essay required a certain amount of thought concerning the register that I was going to use for that. So I hope that's made it a little clearer for you what register is, how it works, and why it's important. My next video will be the last one on the subject of essay writing, for now at least, and it will be a writing prompt. So if you're interested in trying your hand at writing an essay, you can expect some essay writing ideas. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And in the meantime, happy writing.